It started with a scream, not one of those loud, piercing ones that make you run for help, but a distant, muffled cry that sends a chill crawling up your spine. At first, I thought I imagined it. After all, it was 2 a.m., and I was already running on fumes. But then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere near the gas pumps. My name is Nate, and I've been driving for a living since I was 22. Delivery gigs, long-haul trucking, even the occasional ride-share stint, I've done it all. I'm not a stranger to the late-night grind, but something about that shift felt different. Maybe it was the thick fog rolling in off the highway, swallowing everything in its path, or the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't have stopped. I was on my way back from a warehouse delivery in another state, heading home to Chicago. The interstate was empty, save for the occasional semi-truck rumbling by, its headlights cutting through the haze. My fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty, and when I saw the glowing sign for a gas station up ahead, I figured it was my best option. The station looked like it hadn't seen much business in years. The fluorescent lights over the pumps flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow on the cracked asphalt. The convenience store was a small, grimy box with bars on the windows, and the neon open 24-hour sign buzzed faintly. I pulled up to the pump farthest from the building, my truck groaning in protest as I turned off the engine. The moment I stepped out of the cab, I noticed how quiet it was. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of the gas station's lights and the occasional creak of the metal sign swaying in the breeze. I swiped my card at the pump, but the screen flashed an error message. "Figures," I muttered, shoving the card back into my wallet. I glanced toward the convenience store. The thought of going inside to pay made my skin crawl, but I didn't have much choice. The store's windows were coated with a greasy film, and the dim light inside barely illuminated the aisles. I pushed open the door, and a tiny bell jingled overhead. The cashier was a wiry man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. He barely looked up as I approached the counter. "Pump 3?" I said, sliding a 20 across the counter. He grunted in acknowledgement, punching a button on the register. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the convex security mirror mounted in the corner. A woman standing near the back of the store, her long hair obscuring her face. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. My pulse quickened as I scanned the store, but there was no one there. The cashier let out an irritated sigh. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "No, just thought I saw someone," I said, shaking my head. I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Guess I'm more tired than I thought." He didn't respond, just went back to thumbing through a dog-eared magazine. Back at the pump, I filled my tank as quickly as possible, my eyes darting to the fog-shrouded highway every few seconds. The eerie stillness was starting to get to me. I capped the tank, climbed into the truck, and was about to pull away when I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the station's flickering lights. This time, I could see her more clearly. A pale face, hollow eyes, and a tattered dress that clung to her thin frame. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. I rolled down the window a crack. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct told me to drive away. But what if she needed help? What if she'd been stranded out here? I stepped out of the truck and took a few cautious steps toward her. The fog seemed to thicken as I approached, swallowing the space between us. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, she took a step forward and vanished. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone, as if the fog had swallowed her whole. I turned in circles, scanning the lot, but there was no sign of her. The scream came again, louder this time, cutting through the silence like a knife. It sounded like it came from the back of the station. Every rational part of me was screaming to leave, but something pulled me toward the sound. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt, I don't know. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and made my way around the side of the building. The back of the station was even more dilapidated than the front. Rusted dumpsters overflowed with garbage, and a row of broken-down vending machines stood against the wall like forgotten relics. The scream came again, muffled but distinct, and I realized it was coming from one of the machines. I approached the farthest one, my heart pounding in my chest. The glass was smeared with grime, but I could just make out the outline of something or someone inside. "Hello?" I called out, shining the flashlight on the glass. "Can you hear me?" A hand slapped against the inside of the glass, leaving a streak of red. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced. Was this some kind of sick prank? The figure inside the machine shifted, and I caught a glimpse of those same hollow eyes staring back at me. The flashlight flickered, the bulb struggling to stay lit. "Help me," the voice whispered, barely audible through the glass. It was the woman. I didn't think. I just ran. Back to the truck, back to safety. I locked the doors and slammed the accelerator, the tires screeching as I tore out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw the station disappear into the fog, the faint glow of the lights swallowed by darkness. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. When I finally pulled into a rest area, I sat in the truck, trying to make sense of what had happened. It felt like a nightmare, but the streak of blood on my flashlight told me it was real. I quit the delivery gig a week later. I couldn't bring myself to drive that route again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scream in my dreams, and I wake up drenched in sweat. I've thought about going back to that gas station to see if I could find answers, but I'm too scared of what I might discover. Some places are better left in the dark. I still can't bring myself to drive past that gas station. Even now, the thought of it makes my chest tighten. It's been a year since I worked there since that night, but I can still hear the flicker of the old neon sign and smell the faint odor of gasoline mixed with damp asphalt. I keep telling myself it wasn't real, that maybe I imagined it all in the haze of exhaustion. But deep down, I know it was real, too real. My name's Kevin. I'm 27, living in a small town most people would never bother visiting. Life's been ordinary. I've bounced between part-time jobs, never finding anything worth sticking with. A month after getting laid off from a warehouse gig, I landed a position at the gas station off Route 46. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Nights were slow, the kind of slow that gets under your skin and makes the hours drag. The manager, Ted, was the typical overbearing type, the kind of guy who thrived on passive-aggressive sticky notes. He gave me a gruff rundown on my first day: lock the doors at midnight, check inventory, clean the bathrooms, and don't fall asleep. "People think nothing happens out here," he said, his tone implying he knew something I didn't. "But you've got to keep your eyes open." That stuck with me. I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to Ted's attempt at making the job sound important. But as the days turned into weeks, I noticed something strange. Every so often, the security camera feed would flicker just for a second. The first time, I thought it was a glitch, but then it kept happening, always at 2:37 a.m. It was a Tuesday night when everything started. The night air was thick, and the station lights hummed faintly as moths flitted around them. Around 11:45, a guy came in for a pack of smokes. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. He paid in cash, his hands trembling as he handed over the bills. "You work here alone?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, glancing at the clock. He hesitated, his gaze darting toward the window. "Just be careful. Weird stuff happens out here at night." Before I could respond, he walked out, disappearing into the darkness beyond the gas pumps. I shrugged it off and went back to restocking the shelves. By midnight, the station was silent. I locked the doors and settled into the small office behind the counter, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. At 2:37 a.m., the cameras flickered. I sat up, staring at the screen as static washed over it. When the feed returned, everything seemed normal until I noticed movement near pump 3. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still. "Great," I muttered. "Another drunk." I grabbed the mic connected to the intercom. "Hey, station's closed. Come back in the morning." The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, staring at the building. A chill crept up my spine. Something about their posture felt off. Their head was tilted slightly, like they were studying me through the camera. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out their face, but the angle of the light cast their features in shadow. I decided to step outside and shoo them off. Grabbing the flashlight, I unlocked the door and stepped into the cool night air. The figure was still there, unmoving. "Hey," I called out. "You can't be here. The station's closed." They didn't respond. I took a step closer, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "You hear me? You need to leave." As the beam of light fell on them, my breath caught in my throat. Their arms hung unnaturally long, their shoulders too narrow, and their legs bent at angles that didn't look right. They were wearing a hoodie and jeans, but their clothes looked wrong, like they'd been stretched to fit a body that wasn't quite human. I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel their gaze on me, even though I couldn't see their eyes. I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to grab my phone and call Ted. The line rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I stared at the cameras, hoping the figure would leave, but they stayed there, standing completely still. And then they took a step. It wasn't a normal step. It was slow, deliberate, like they were testing how to move. My stomach twisted as they took another step, their body jerking awkwardly, like a puppet on strings. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. "It's just some weirdo messing with you." The figure reached the door, their face now pressed against the glass. My flashlight had only given me a glimpse before, but now I could see them clearly, or rather, I could see the lack of a face. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over an unnaturally shaped skull. I backed away, my mind racing. The cameras flickered again, and when they came back, the figure was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping the edge of the counter, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the building made me jump. The clock ticked, agonizingly slow, and the silence pressed in around me. By 4 a.m., I started to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that maybe it was a trick of the light or exhaustion playing games with my mind. And then I heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the lights. I froze, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of metal scraping against glass. My stomach churned as I realized it was coming from the back door, the one that led to the storage room. I grabbed the flashlight again, my legs feeling like jelly as I made my way toward the sound. The door had a small window, and as I got closer, I saw a shadow moving on the other side. My breath hitched as I reached for the door handle, hesitating. "Who's there?" I called out. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung the door open. The alley behind the station was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights barely illuminating the pavement. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. Nothing. As I turned to go back inside, I heard the faint sound of breathing just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and I bolted back inside, slamming the door shut. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of fear and paranoia. By the time the morning sun began to rise, I was a wreck. When Ted showed up to relieve me, I barely managed to mumble an excuse before rushing to my car. I never went back. Ted called me later that day, asking why I'd left the storage room door open and why there were deep scratches in the glass. I didn't have an answer for him. All I know is that whatever was out there that night, it wasn't human, and I pray I never see it again. It all started with the sound of breaking glass, not a shatter like someone dropping a bottle, but a sharp, deliberate crack like a window giving under pressure. I froze in my seat, my hand hovering over the gear shift, unsure if I'd imagined it. The night was quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the eerie stillness pressed against my ears like a warning. My name's Ethan. I'm a sales rep, and I spend more time on the road than I do at home. I've always thought of myself as pretty level-headed, used to strange towns, late nights, and the occasional run-in with sketchy characters at truck stops. But that night was different. It was my second week on a long stretch of back-to-back trips, and exhaustion had settled in like an unwelcome passenger. I'd left Louisville earlier that afternoon, planning to drive straight through to Cleveland, but my body had other ideas. Around midnight, I realized I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. That's when I saw the gas station, a lone beacon in the middle of nowhere, its glowing sign promising fuel, coffee, and a chance to stretch my legs. The place wasn't exactly inviting. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 80s, with faded paint, cracked windows, and a sagging roof over the pumps. The sign above the convenience store flickered. Half the letters burnt out, so it read MRTM ARC-T. But at that hour, I wasn't picky. I pulled into the lot, parked under the dim light of a street lamp, and climbed out of my car. The air was cold and still, and the faint smell of gasoline hung heavy around me. As I stretched, I noticed the station's only other occupant, a beat-up pickup truck parked near the far end of the lot. The cab was empty, but the engine was running, its soft rumble barely audible over the buzz of the fluorescent lights. I walked toward the store, my boots crunching against the gravel. The windows were dark, and I wasn't sure if the place was even open until I noticed a shadow moving inside. I pushed open the door, the jingle of the bell breaking the silence. The clerk was a wiry guy with greasy hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't look up as I entered, his eyes glued to a small TV on the counter. Some old black and white movie played on the screen, the flickering images casting strange shadows on his face. "Pump 2, I said, fishing a 20 out of my wallet. He grunted, took the bill, and punched something into the register. As I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were following me, even though his head never moved. Back outside, the night seemed darker than before, the fog thickening around the edges of the lot. I filled up my tank, the rhythmic click of the pump the only sound. That's when I heard it, the glass breaking. It was faint, but close enough to make my skin prickle. I glanced toward the store, but the clerk was still inside, glued to his TV. The sound came again, sharper this time, and I realized it was coming from the pickup truck. I hesitated, my hand tightening on the nozzle. The truck's engine was still running, but the cab was empty, or at least I thought it was. The windows were tinted just enough to make it hard to see inside. As I stood there, debating whether to investigate, the truck's headlights flicked on, blinding me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, and the pump clicked off. When I looked again, the truck was gone, its taillights disappearing into the fog. Relieved, I climbed back into my car, eager to put the whole weird encounter behind me. I started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and merged back onto the highway. For the first few miles, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck following me. But the road behind me remained empty, and gradually, my nerves began to settle. The highway stretched on, the fog thickening with every mile. I passed no other cars, no towns, just an endless expanse of dark, empty road. The rhythmic thrum of my tires against the pavement was almost hypnotic, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy again. Just as I reached for my coffee, something darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote. But as my headlights swept over it, I realized it was a person. A woman, her clothes tattered and her hair hanging in her face. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I rolled down my window, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't respond. I considered getting out of the car, but something about her posture so rigid, so unnatural, kept me rooted in my seat. "Do you need help?" I tried again. Still nothing. My fingers tightened on the wheel, and I glanced in the rearview mirror, debating whether to back up and go around her. That's when I saw the truck. It was sitting a few yards behind me, its headlights off, but the faint rumble of its engine was unmistakable. Panic set in. I didn't know if the woman and the truck were connected, but my instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I shifted into reverse, intending to back away slowly, but as soon as I moved, the truck's headlights flicked on. The woman turned her head, her hollow eyes meeting mine through the windshield. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of her lips that sent ice through my veins. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, swerving around her and speeding down the highway. The truck's engine roared behind me, its lights growing brighter as it gained on me. For miles, the chase continued, the truck never falling far behind. I tried calling 911, but my phone had no signal. The fog grew thicker, the road narrower, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around me. Finally, I spotted a sign for another gas station up ahead. Desperate, I veered into the lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The truck barreled past me, disappearing into the fog. I sat there trembling, my hands gripping the wheel. The station was dark, abandoned, but at that moment it felt like the safest place in the world. I climbed out of the car, my legs shaking, and leaned against the hood, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard it, the sound of breaking glass. This time, it was louder, closer, and coming from inside the station. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw the silhouette of a figure in the window. It was the woman. Her hollow eyes stared back at me, and her twisted smile widened. I don't remember getting back into my car. I don't remember driving away. All I know is that I didn't stop until I reached home, where I locked every door and sat in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. I haven't been back on the road since. I don't know why I keep replaying that night in my head. Maybe I'm hoping I'll notice something I missed, a detail that would make it all make sense. But every time I think about it, I only feel more certain. Something unnatural happened at that gas station, and I'll never forget it. My name's Brandon, and I've worked a lot of odd jobs in my life. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep the bills paid and the fridge stocked. About 6 months ago, I took a night shift job at a gas station about 15 miles out of town. It wasn't my first choice, but with rent creeping up, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. The station was small, just a couple of pumps, a cramped convenience store, and an old mechanical car wash that hadn't worked in years. The owner, Frank, hired me on the spot. He was the kind of guy who looked like he'd been smoking since birth, with a permanent scowl and a raspy voice that always sounded annoyed. The night shift's easy, he told me. Hardly anyone comes through, so just keep an eye on the cameras, restock the shelves, and lock up if you need to. And whatever you do, don't mess with pump 3. Why not? I asked, thinking he was joking. Frank just gave me a look, a long, hard stare that made my skin crawl. It's broken. Leave it alone. I didn't push it. The guy wasn't exactly a fountain of conversation. The first few weeks were uneventful. Most nights, the station was dead silent, save for the occasional trucker or local stumbling in for a coffee or a pack of cigarettes. I spent most of my shifts scrolling through my phone or listening to podcasts. It was boring, sure, but boring was fine. I wasn't looking for excitement. Then came the night I wish I could forget. It was a Friday, just past 1 a.m., and the station was completely deserted. A light rain was falling, the kind that makes everything feel a little colder and lonelier. I was sitting behind the counter, half watching the security monitors, when I noticed something strange. Pump 3's screen was lit up. That shouldn't have been possible. The pump had been shut off for years, the display dead and covered in a thin layer of grime. But there it was, glowing faintly in the dark. I stared at the monitor, trying to convince myself it was a glitch. Maybe the power had flickered, or the rain had shorted something out. I grabbed the walkie. Frank had left me for emergencies and debated calling him, but I could already hear his gravelly voice in my head, telling me to stop bothering him over nothing. I decided to check it out myself. The rain had picked up by the time I stepped outside, the cold droplets stinging my face. The air smelled like wet asphalt and gasoline. As I approached Pump 3, I could see the faint blue glow of the screen through the mist. My stomach tightened. Just a glitch, I muttered under my breath. Nothing weird, but when I got closer, I froze. The screen wasn't just lit up. It was displaying numbers, the kind you'd see if someone was actively pumping gas. The dollar amount ticked higher and higher, even though the nozzle was still in its cradle. I reached out and tapped the screen. It felt warm, almost like it was alive. The number stopped for a moment, then started climbing again, faster this time. My heart was pounding. I stepped back, shaking my head. This wasn't normal. I turned to head back inside when I saw something or someone standing at the edge of the lot. It was hard to make out through the rain, but there was definitely a figure there, just beyond the glow of the overhead lights. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still, watching me. My throat went dry. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. "The station's closed." No response. They just stood there, their outline blurry in the downpour. A bolt of fear shot through me, but I tried to keep my cool. I turned and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone to call Frank, but before I could dial, the security monitors flickered. When they came back, the figure was gone. I spent the next hour pacing the store, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. The rain had stopped, but the station felt darker somehow, like the lights weren't as bright as they'd been before. I checked the cameras again, but everything looked normal. Pump three's screen was dark now, the numbers gone. I told myself it was over, that I'd imagined the whole thing, and for a while I believed it. Around 3 a.m., a car pulled into the lot, a beat-up sedan with a missing hubcap. A man got out, middle-aged and balding, wearing a stained windbreaker. He shuffled into the store, nodding at me as he grabbed a coffee. "Quiet night?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Not much going on." He paid in cash and turned to leave, but then he stopped, glancing over his shoulder. "Say, you ever hear any weird stories about this place?" he asked. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Ah, never mind. Forget I said anything. Have a good one, kid." Before I could press him, he was gone, his car disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, the pit in my stomach growing. At 3:37 a.m., the cameras flickered again. This time, when they came back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was back, standing in the same spot as before. But now there were more of them, 3, maybe 4, their shapes barely visible in the grainy footage. I backed away from the monitor, my pulse racing. The walkie crackled to life on the counter, making me jump. "Brandon," Frank's voice rasped, low and urgent. "Get out of there." "What?" I stammered, grabbing the walkie. "Frank, what's going on?" "They're back," he said. "I don't know what they want, but you need to leave, now." "Who's back?" I demanded, but the walkie cut to static. I looked at the monitors again. The figures were closer now, their movements jerky and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as one of them turned its head toward the camera. Even through the grainy feed, I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was just smooth, featureless skin stretched over a skull-like shape. The lights in the store flickered, and I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then the pounding started. It came from the glass doors, loud and relentless, like someone or something was trying to break in. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The figures were there, pressed against the glass, their faceless heads tilted at unnatural angles. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted out the back door, my feet pounding against the wet pavement as I ran toward my car. I didn't look back, not until I was safely inside, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures were still there, standing in the middle of the lot, watching me. I quit the next day. Frank didn't argue. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something is wrong with that gas station, and I'll never set foot there again. Some places are better left alone.